David Heathcote 3536. If the warp is fueled by emotion, where is love, joy, and happiness, etc.? You don't have those in Warhammer. That doesn't exist in Warhammer 40k. Hello, I am Arbitor Ian. I talk to a camera about Warhammer. And last time I was here on IGN, I answered a load of questions from the community, novice, adept, and expert level questions about Warhammer. And people had follow-up questions. So this time we're going to answer even more questions about Warhammer. We're going to delve into some areas of the galaxy we didn't really cover last time.
The threat of chaos must be driven back.
First question, Mosrel the Waker says, is there a 40k version of the internet? And if so, is it restricted to trusted agents of the Imperium, or is it open to the general public? So, in the Imperium, there are a lot of worlds, all of which are at wildly different stages of development. You have worlds which are like pre-medieval feral societies, and you have worlds that are very high-tech cyberpunk dystopias. So it's realistic to expect that some version of an internet exists on the more advanced worlds, but because of the way space travel works and space communication works, there isn't like one thing that links the whole Imperium. All communication between worlds is done by psychic means. So there's no general Imperium internet. We do get a lot of mentions of like data nets and things like that, local to planets, certainly more advanced planets when investigators are there trying to uncover heresy or crime, but there's no like Imperium-wide internet. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the people who control most of the technology of the Imperium, have a thing called the noosphere, which is a wireless way in which they can communicate and transfer data between themselves, but it's unlikely that anyone who isn't part of the Adeptus Mechanicus would have access to the noosphere. General Rasp says, is there a difference between a Navigator and a Psyker, and do all ships have navigators? Navigators are psychic. They're a stable strain of psychic mutant that was created way back in the dark age of technology as a way of helping humanity guide ships through the warp. This is well before 40k or the Emperor or the Imperium. And those stable bloodlines of navigators persisted because they were necessary for space exploration. So navigators are psychic. It's just that their psychic abilities are very limited and very tightly bound to piloting a ship through the warp. However, there still aren't enough navigators to do every ship the Imperium needs. Back in the Dark Age of technology, there seem to have been some devices that allowed humans to make reasonable length warp jumps without needing a navigator. But the general rule is that without a navigator, you can pilot a ship into the warp, but you can only do a really short jump. So a long route will take lots and lots of individual jumps, which means that short-range merchant ships might not bother having navigators. Small ships that are content to do things really slowly might not have navigators. And generally, navigators are reserved for, Imperial Navy military vessels or the bigger rogue trader merchant ships. Sosainzo says, in any instance would an Astartes side with an alien in order to complete some duty? If so, could an Inquisitor set the Astartes to death? This is one of those grey areas. We definitely have examples of very high-ranking Astartes making deals with aliens when they think it would benefit the Imperium. Quite recently in Vigilus, Marnius Calgard does a deal with the Eldar to fight off Orks and Chaos attackers. So it does happen. Generally, it's not something they enjoy doing. They fundamentally see it as heresy. They just have to pick the least heretical heresy. So yes, it happens. Usually some of the Astartes really don't like that decision being made, but they all accept it has to happen. An Inquisitor could take offense at that and decide that this is heresy and they should never have done it. Inquisitors deciding that Astartes chapters have to be purged for heresy. It takes quite a lot of Inquisitors agreeing in order to make that really happen. Astartes chapters are very powerful and very independent. They generally ignore a lot of inquisitorial things. So the chances that one Inquisitor thinking that was heresy would have any effect are pretty minimal. Sudden Identity 6500. What is the relation between the Inquisition and the Adeptus Mechanicus? Isn't the Omnissiah a blatant heresy, presumably against the Imperial faith? Yes and no. The Inquisition are sort of like the investigators and secret police of the Imperium, they sort of investigate and root out heresy and corruption. The Adeptus Mechanicus control all the technology and have always been a little bit apart from the rest of the Imperium. They were their own empire before they got sort of subsumed into the Imperium as a whole. The Inquisition does maintain a Ordo whose job is to oversee what the Mechanicus are doing and look out for tech heresy. There are things that the Mechanicus are not meant to look into. So there is an inquisitorial department who are charged with that. How much they can actually make the Mechanicus do anything is questionable. The Mechanicum are very powerful. They are fully in control of their own sovereign territory and they have their own armies. So it's relatively difficult to just stop them doing something because an Inquisitor doesn't like it. However, obviously, if it was something really, really big, if a whole Forge world was falling to heresy, then that Inquisitor could find out maybe a conclave of Inquisitors could do something about it, or at least they could inform the other Forge worlds. So it's a bit like the relationship with the Space Marines. The Inquisition are meant to watch over them. How effective they are at doing anything about it is questionable. The Omnissiah is a slightly different thing. The Adeptus Mechanicus have their own religion, a religion that the Emperor, when he was stamping out religions, didn't stamp out. And their belief is that there is a tripartite deity of machines. The machine god, which is sort of the idea of all knowledge from whence all information and intelligence comes. So they worship that in the guise of science and technology. The motive force, which is somewhere between just electricity and the idea of kinetic energy, like everything that powers their machines. And then finally, the Omnissiah, which is the earthly incarnation of the machine god. In the Heresy, the people who sided with the Emperor were the ones who believed that the Emperor was the Omnissiah. And generally, that is the official belief of the Adeptus Mechanicus. So it's not heresy because they still worship the Emperor as a god. It's just not the same god everyone else in the Imperium worships him as. 103, the Destroyer 5, says, what is the second founding, and are there more foundings or more types of foundings? Yes, there are a load more foundings. The first founding happened when the Emperor made the Primarchs and then the Space Marine legions. There were 20 legions to start with, and they all went out and they did the Great Crusade, and all that collapsed in the fires of the Horus Heresy, which is a whole different video. After the Horus Heresy, the Imperium was a bit of a wreck. A lot of the Space Marine legions had been reduced massively in size. They were a shadow of their former selves. And the focus of the Imperium had sort of shifted from constant outward expansion to trying to protect and consolidate what they had left. The remnants of these legions, which were hundreds of thousands of legionnaires strong, were broken down into individual chapters. Each chapter had about 1,000 Marines in it, and they were told to go and watch over a specific area of space, or maybe patrol a specific area of space to keep it safe. And that change, where those legions were broken down into chapters, is called the second founding. One chapter would retain the colours and the homeworld and the fortress of the old legion, and all the other ones would pick new colours and new homeworlds and new fortresses. Since then, there have been other foundings. I think we're up to about 30 foundings happening every few hundred years when the Imperium finds itself beset on all sides. Each of these foundings creates a number of new Space Marine chapters, maybe only a couple, maybe 10 or 20. And those Space Marine chapters are either created from existing chapters and their reserves of gene seed, which are portioned out, or they're created from gene seed reserves that are held on Terra. When those are created, often some veteran Marines from a very highly regarded current chapter will be asked to go and serve as the officer corps, and it'll take a while for them to get up and running. But yeah, there are loads of foundings. I think the Ultima founding is the most recent, and that is the one that created Primaris Marines. So that was a huge founding of chapters. And I think the Ultima founding is around the 30th. Jonathan O'Dwyer, 7079. What is the deal with certain Space Marine chapters turning into wolves or having serious bloodlust? Is this degenerative process involved in all chapters, traitor and loyalist? If not, what's the cause? It varies. Space Marines are created by this very complex, very advanced, slightly magic process of gene seed, which takes a regular child and turns him into this giant 8-foot-tall super soldier. And that was developed by the Emperor and the Emperor's scientists 10,000 years before during the Great Crusade. However, one of the very first things that happened that sort of messed with this a bit was that the Primarchs, who were meant to be the genetic templates for these legions and help stabilize and create new gene seed, were immediately scattered across the galaxy, and he had to go out and find them while he was doing the crusade. What this meant is that creating new Space Marines was difficult. Weird mutations and inefficiencies crept into the reproductive process. And of course, after 10,000 years of this, which is potentially much longer than Space Marines were meant to be around, those things started to get worse. Each Space Marine chapter draws from a different population, a different world. Those populations might have different genetic characteristics. Those might interact with gene seed in different ways. Something like the Blood Angel's bloodlust is caused by a mutation of one of their special Astartes organs. It's the one that allows them to eat brains and get the memories of their enemies. That's a little bit overactive in a lot of Blood Angels. The Space Wolves turning into wolves is never fully explained, but is implied to be something to do with the unique genetics of Fenris, their planet. It doesn't apply to all chapters, but a lot of chapters or legions or traitor warbands have some weird quirk of genetics like that. Of course, with the traitors, part of the problem is that they have been living in the warp for an awful long time, so other mutations might have occurred. Jawa Scrapper 6277. What do we actually know about the two Space Marine legions that were erased from the Imperial records? The answer to that is not much. The Emperor created 20 Primarchs. Each Primarch had a legion of Space Marines associated with them. And we know that during the Great Crusade, the Emperor managed to find all 20 Primarchs and reunite all of them with their legions. But at some point after that, but before the Horus Heresy, two Primarchs were lost. And when they were lost, all records of them were erased to the level even of like psychic manipulation of the rest of the Space Marines and the Primarchs, so they didn't really remember much about them. There are hints that one or both of them were lost during this massive alien war that happened in the Crusade, called the Rangdan Xenocides against an alien empire called the Rangda. And we don't know much about them either, but we do know that they had some sort of like brainworm mind control technology, so maybe that's why they were purged, but it's very much a hint and we don't actually know what happened to them. Patrick Beckers asks, who is Alpha Primus? And why does Robute Gilliman hate Alpha Primus? I think that is a bit of an exaggeration. I'm not sure hate's the right word. Alpha Primus is a prototype Primaris Space Marine. So, the Mechanicum Magus Belisarius Cawl spent 10,000 years since the Heresy trying to invent Primaris Space Marines. In fact, he spent all that time. He took people from way back then and started implanting them with gene seed all the way back then. And Alpha Primus, as far as anyone can tell, was his prototype. He's a prototype Space Marine with elements of the gene seed of all, let's say, the Loyalist legions in him. He's also quite a powerful Psyker, and he has an interesting relationship with Belisarius Cawl. He technically is his like servant stroke bodyguard, but he also sort of dislikes him. Alpha Primus is in constant pain from all these upgrades that were very much prototype upgrades. So Alpha Primus is a servant and emissary of Belisarius Cawl who maybe doesn't like his dad very much, which is a big theme in Warhammer. And of course, Robute Gilliman doesn't fully trust Cawl either. I would suggest that Gilliman doesn't trust the motives of Alpha Primus rather than actually hating him. Susan Grimshaw, 1674. Maximum difficulty question here. How was Calas Typhon made into an Astartes if he's half Xenos? Very good question. Calas Typhon is the first captain, was the first captain, still sort of is the first captain, of the Death Guard, which are one of the traitor legions, better known in 40k as Typhus, who is a big character in the Death Guard. And the home planet of the Death Guard was Barbarous, which was this world where the humans were kept enslaved by evil alien overlords. And in one of the books, we are told that Typhon has some evil alien overlord in him. He has a bit of evil alien overlord blood. It's really hard to say that quickly. And we also know that that should make him like unviable to be turned into a Space Marine. They do genetic testing and they find out things, and often the gene seed won't work if you're not fully human or even the right sort of human. So as far as we know, Typhon shouldn't be turned into a Space Marine because he's half Xenos. Very good point. However, that has happened before. In old versions of the game, there's a guy called Ilian Nastase, very, very old lore, but was the Ultramarines chief librarian and also half Eldar. That's sort of been retconned out of existence, but it has happened before. It's because of 40k's link to fantasy and how like half-elves were a thing. Officially, we don't know how Typhon made it into the Space Marines, because there is definitely lore saying he shouldn't be able to. But the other thing about Typhon is that he's a Psyker, so it could be the case that he sort of convinced everyone to let him anyway. Unanswerable question. Jake Hinton says, is he, the Emperor, on the Golden Throne, or is he sitting in a chair under the Golden Throne and what everyone sees is just a statue? Era of Ruin has f***ed me up with that one. So, as everybody knows, the Emperor sits on the Golden Throne underneath the palace on Terra, except the big question there is, what's the Golden Throne? Most of the devotional images spread around the Imperium that depict the Golden Throne are of this golden figure shining with light, seated on this big gold ornate chair, covered in statues and effigies all the way down, and it's meant to be an inspirational image. And maybe that is what it might have once looked like. But by the point of Era of Ruin, which is set quite early into the Imperium, the Emperor, mortally wounded, has been on it for a while, and at that point it looks like some older artwork. It looks like a corpse strapped to a load of wires. And that has given rise to this idea that actually maybe that's the real Emperor and there's a fake Emperor on the throne. I don't think the book actually says that, but I think the implication is that what the people of the Imperium think the Golden Throne looks like, this grand, devotional temple object, isn't actually what it is. What it looks like is a horrific medical machine. David Heathcote 3536, if the warp is fueled by emotion, where is love, joy and happiness, etc.? You don't have those in Warhammer. That doesn't exist in Warhammer 40k. No, only joking. Obviously, there are people in the stories who love each other and find happiness and joy. Not often. They're mostly stories about wars, but that does exist. The usual explanation is that the amount of anger and suffering is just a lot more than the amount of love and joy. And thus, the anger and suffering emotions have a much bigger presence in the warp. And not all emotions in the warp immediately turn into some sort of warp entity, only the ones that are really, really, really big. And so the Chaos Gods tend to embody the worst emotions, because those are the ones that are everywhere. But there's also an idea that the Chaos Gods represent excesses of any emotion. The Chaos God Khorne, for example, is the god of anger. Khorne can't ever choose not to be angry. All he wants is more anger all the time. He can't moderate and have a little bit. And any emotion taken to that level, any being in the warp made of just one emotion who only wants as much as possible of that emotion, that's inherently a destructive thing. So imagine what the warp god of happiness looks like, and it's kind of horrible. Quiet Reason 8679, does the shadow in the warp that's produced by an advancing Tyranid hive fleet weaken chaos forces such as demons or chaos sorcerers? Could it outright dispel demons from the physical plane or close warp rifts? So the Tyranids travel between the stars in vast hive fleets, which are like fleets of living ships that often create and spawn the little Tyranids you see in games like Space Marine 2. When that hive fleet advances, it projects this psychic interference. It's often just the communication between all the ships. And that psychic interference, it's like white noise in the warp. It stops any other psychic communication happening. And it's described loads of different ways, from like an incredibly loud signal where any Psyker trying to tap into the warp and use their abilities is immediately overwhelmed and often goes mad, to like a deadening of the warp. All the seas of the warp are immediately still and calm. And yeah, in theory, that should affect Chaos worshippers too. A lot of Chaos servants need their psychic powers to contact the warp, and in theory, they should find that much more difficult when the Tyranids turn up. But we also know that the Tyranids have fought Chaos powers and sometimes fought demons. You can do that in the game, so evidently it isn't the most foolproof solution. Ozai75 says, how is Trazyn the Infinite so powerful that he has literal custodies as part of his collection? And I think the answer to that is different sorts of power. Custodians, the Adeptus Custodes, are absurdly powerful individually warriors who serve the Emperor as bodyguards. They're much more powerful than a Space Marine. They're the pinnacle of the Emperor's genetic technology. Trazyn the Infinite is a Necron overlord, and while yes, he is a walking skeleton and probably not quite as powerful as high-ranking Custodes in combat, the Necrons have some of the most advanced technology in the game, particularly technology that kind of works like a Pokeball. It allows them to capture people and hold them in stasis, and then release them whenever they find them useful. They also have technology that shackles their mind to whatever the Necron overlord wants. So Trazyn the Infinite is an obsessive Necron collector who has collected one of everything and put it in his giant space museum in a stasis field. So the answer to that is that yes, Custodes are very powerful, but Necron technology is absurdly powerful. The only reason they're not using it to dominate the galaxy is that after 10,000 years of sleeping, some of it's gone a bit wrong, and most of them haven't woken up yet. Deccan asks, is the Ork red ones go faster or branches shoot bullets so they do belief just manifested chaos akin to reality engines? Okay, so this is a common meme, really, that's sort of blown out of proportion on the internet. What's actually happening is a little simpler. Orks are quite an interesting species, and one of the things they do is utilize the warp in a slightly different way to a lot of other species. In 40k, there is a general idea, no matter the species, that very, very strong willpower creates psychic effects. You need very strong willpower, very strong belief to make your psychic powers work or to control them well. And there's also this idea that even if people aren't psychers, everyone's got a little spark of connection to the warp. And if millions or thousands or even a few hundred of really, really strong-willed ones really believe something, that can sort of affect reality. It doesn't mean that anything really big is going to happen. It means that the wheels of reality are greased. And there's an argument that that's what happens when the Sisters of Battle, the Adeptus Sororitas, fervently pray to the Emperor for a miracle. Yeah, sometimes it's a miracle, but sometimes it's just all that self-belief having an effect. The Orks, who are a genetically engineered species made by the Old Ones to fight wars, are built around that concept. All their psychic energy glues together in the warp and doesn't go into the general warp pool of emotional energy. It's this big green orky mass of orc energy. And that means that a lot of the time, Orks really believing something can make it more likely to happen. Now, what's happened since then is that sometimes the fan base has run wild from that and decided that that means that if an Ork picks up a branch and believes it's a gun, it'll shoot bullets. And it's not that big. It won't work to that level. It's more the case that technology that shouldn't really function as well as it does tends to function just fine if an Ork's using it. Red ones go faster is a great example of that because we don't really know if it's true or not. Orks believe that red vehicles go faster. That is a core belief they have. So they paint their vehicles red and then they go faster. So is that the Orky psychic energy? Or is that just because the guys painting the vehicles red drive faster? Is it the placebo effect? Or is it really happening? No one can be totally sure.
From long experience, have I learned that underestimating the greenskins is a fast route to the grave.
So that's all the follow-up questions. Now we're on to Reddit questions, which deal with the rest of the universe in 40k. And we're going to continue with Orks. According Ice 4863, are Orks actually stupid or are they just weird? The answer to that is kind of both. Orks are genetically engineered by the Old Ones to self-perpetuate as a violent, warlike race. They were designed to fight this massive war. They were designed quite late into it when the Old Ones were having quite a lot of trouble winning it. And the way that Orks work is that the more fighting they do, the bigger they get and the smarter they get. And the other thing with Orks is that an awful lot of their technological knowledge is hard-coded into their genes. So various Orks will just happen to grow up with an innate knowledge of how to build things. They don't know how they know that. They might not be able to explain it to you. They just look at all the parts and go, oh yeah, that makes a spaceship, and do it. And it's difficult to explain that on a scale of how intelligent they are. They just sort of know what to do. Certainly, your basic regular orc who isn't very big and hasn't been around very long doesn't understand anything of science and technology. And a very big war boss who's been around for ages and has grown to a huge size is probably very tactically and strategically smart, though they don't really understand why or think of it in those terms. So orcs have lots and lots of knowledge, but they might not be very clever. It's a weird question to answer. Okay, the longest pool noodle. What makes the orcs a legitimate threat to the rest of the galaxy? There are a number of reasons. As we said, orcs are designed to self-perpetuate. Orcs are extremely hard to eradicate. Any orc spores, they're kind of like a fungus, so they shed spores all the time. The way their genetics works is that any of those spores could grow into orcs, who also grow their own food, who also grow their own servants, who also grow their own people eventually, who just understand technology. So just leaving a few orc spores for a few hundred years, and you end up with a technologically advanced, warlike, interstellar group of orcs rampaging around the place. So the real problem here is not that their technology is the most advanced, it's that there's just loads of them, and they can very quickly, with very few resources and no outside help or communication, turn into a interstellar threat. Astacask, do the Tau have any real conception of the size of the Imperium or the knowledge of its history? Questionable. It's certainly likely that the people very, very high up in the Tau Empire understand sort of how big the Imperium could be and how long it's been around. There is this idea that the real high-ups are quite worried by the idea that this empire is so much older than their entire species has existed. That sort of information is not the sort of thing they will tell everyone else in the Tau Empire. That would be bad for morale, bad for the greater good. So most Tau are certainly not aware of the size and scale of the Imperium. Some might be. It's unlikely they have a full map. Kizrock94, have the Tau ever dissected and studied a space marine to implement a super soldier program of their own? Yes, so they have studied it. There are reports that Tau have captured space marines, taken them apart and figured out how they work. They don't do that though for a few reasons. First, they kind of consider it distasteful. The Tau are built into these castes that are sort of have evolved to be genetically different, but generally the Tau don't practice much in the way of bioengineering. Most of their technology is, normal, like advanced science. So there's an idea that they actually look at space marines and go, this is almost distastefully crude compared to their sleek battle suits and potential mind control helms. The other thing we have to bear in mind is that while the Tau are more advanced than the Imperium in some ways, one way they are definitely not more advanced is in bioengineering. Dark age of technology humanity were the masters of modifying humans to do all sorts of different jobs, and that isn't really something that the Tau Empire have fully gotten bored with yet. Baby Proper 9938, why don't the Eldar ever join the greater good? Wouldn't it make sense to unite against Slaanesh? Interesting question there, right? Because do the Tau really have any conception of what Slaanesh is? I see the idea, right? In theory, they're both Xenos species. They're both the Xenos species that we think of as being maybe the nicer ones for Warhammer. Why wouldn't they possibly align? Generally, it's because I think they don't really understand each other and they're coming from very different places. The Tau are this young, energetic, secular, scientific species who believe that they have this great plan to unite the galaxy. The Eldar are ancient, extremely psychic and spiritual, perceive the galaxy in an entirely different way, and also, and this is very important, consider all the other species of the galaxy to be less than them. The Eldar think the most important people are the Eldar, and they kind of see everyone else as an unevolved child. So their worldviews are very, very different, and their ways they perceive the galaxy are very different. So they're very different species with very different ways of perceiving the galaxy. The Tau don't really understand what the warp is, why it's the threat it is, and what really a Slaanesh is. Project Ioros. Why don't all Eldar become followers of Ennead? Okay. So, the Eldar are divided into a number of different groups, many of which have been around for a very long time. The Craftworld Eldar are the ones who saw the fall of the Eldar and went, whoa, we shouldn't do that anymore, and have yoked themselves to very specific, like monk-like paths so that they can control their emotions and not summon a Slaanesh again. The Drakari are the descendants of the people who did the summoning of Slaanesh, and to avoid being eaten by Slaanesh, they torture people and ingest their life force. And of course, the Harlequins Imperiums dedicate themselves to a different god, Segarak, and Segarak is said to protect their souls from Slaanesh. The Inari are a new sect. The Inari believe that if enough Eldar die, their souls will form into a god of death called Ennead, and Ennead will protect their souls from being eaten by Slaanesh. So, that's the theory. But it's worth saying that that is, of course, an apocalypse cult. It's a death cult. In order to do this, lots and lots of Eldar have to die in order to make enough souls to fight against Slaanesh. So it's understandable that lots of other Eldar aren't willing to completely change their beliefs they've had for thousands of years, in order to join the death cult. Hammer Floyd, can someone explain how a Genestealer cult actually works? A lot of cults in 40k. Genestealers are a Tyranid infiltration organism, and the way they work is that a Genestealer, which is very obviously not a human, lands on a planet and sort of does an alien face hugger on some local people. And those people then start to grow a little baby Genestealer inside them. In fact, that little baby Genestealer is a Genestealer hybrid. And part of the effect this has, because Tyranids are a psychic species, is that the person thinks this is their kid, wants to take care of it, and also probably will follow the psychic imperatives of the Genestealer who originally infected them. Over time, this becomes a very big problem. You end up with this network of parents who have been infected, giving birth to these weird Genestealer hybrids, which they then hide away underground, all following the psychic imperative of the original Genestealer, who becomes this massive patriarch of an extended clan and family who work underground. The goal of this is that the brood of Genestealers, growing in the shadows, will collectively send out like a psychic message into the warp, alerting the Tyranids that here's a load of biomass they can feast on. And as the Tyranid hive fleet gets closer, the Genestealers will rise up in glorious revolution, destabilizing the planet's military and making it easier for the Tyranids to win. That's the long-term goal. How it actually works is that, a load of people are infected, they give birth to hybrids who look quite Genestealery, and eventually they'll give birth to more hybrids who look less Genestealery, and eventually, I think by the 4th generation, they're giving birth to people who look mostly like humans, but still have Genestealer genes and are still working on behalf of the local Genestealer cult, following the will of its patriarch. And those become very dangerous. They get into all the political systems, they get into all the military structures, and they're passable, maybe with a hood, for a normal person. And eventually, all the more human-looking ones will deliberately, set up layers underground, often in sewers or in mines, so that they can hide away all the more dodgy-looking ones. And eventually, you end up with this massive infiltration of an entire planet. And following on very closely from that question, Johnny50 Alive says, are all members of Genestealer cults aware that they're Genestealers? Are there any examples of Imperial loyalist Genestealers fighting against the influence of the hive mind? Most citizens of the Imperium, which is who these people were before they were Genestealer cultists, aren't aware of what Tyranids are anyway. So the way that this is often sold to the cultists is that they believe in a savior coming. They believe in often what is termed the four-armed emperor, which means that the psychic signals from these Tyranids have got sort of mixed up in their brains with their existing religion devoted to the emperor, and they start to worship this weird version of it, thinking of it as the four-armed emperor. They often see any approaching Tyranids as like glorious angels, maybe sent by the emperor to save them. So the actual cultists aren't really aware of what's going on. They sort of don't see why they're a problem. They often might see themselves as like the real true followers of the real true four-armed emperor, rising up in glorious revolution against the bad guys, right? Usually, Genestealer cultists don't really know what's going on. They will, of course, be turned into biomass by the Tyranids when the Tyranids turn up. So they're all going to die too, but they just don't really know that that's going to happen. Are there examples of people becoming cultists and then fighting against the cult? Generally, no. Generally, the psychic control is too much. But The way some planets work is, of course, the cult grows and grows and grows, and it gets into all the organizations of power, and it starts to run the entire planet, which means that all the people who aren't infected are sort of forced to go along with it too. There's a great example in a book called Death Worlder of some people who went along with the cult as it was growing, thinking it was just some new religion and supporting it. They weren't infected, and then realizing too late what was actually happening and trying to help out the Imperials when they arrived to fight the Genestealers. And obviously by that point they're considered heretics. It's far too late. They didn't realize what they'd done, etc., etc. Exo-1 Opossum. How immune are non-human races like Xenos to chaos corruption in Warhammer 40k? Why don't we ever see chaos-worshipping greenskins, Tau, Eldar, Necrons or Tyranids with the various roaming chaos warbands or in chaos-controlled territory like the Warp? Couple of different ways of answering that one, right? The obvious one is that having a chaos version of every single faction is probably too many factions for the game to support, so they don't really go there. In the very ancient past, you did get things like Chaos Squats. I think there was some Chaos Eldar occasionally. I think we've had mutated Ork models like a very long time ago. However, generally, the way it's been written is that all the different Xenos species have some way of naturally being quite good at avoiding chaos. I will now go through them. The greenskins were obviously engineered by the old ones. They were well aware of the dangers of the warp, and all their psychic energy sticks together in a big green orky mass, so orcs generally tend to be pretty immune to chaos. I mean, they'll do all the fighting and bloodshed, it's just not gonna corn them all up. The Tau have almost no psychic presence in the warp, so they don't really understand it, and they're quite hard to, mutate or taint with it, because they don't know what any of it is. They don't really worship the warp, and they have no way of really trying to use it for their own power, because they can't do sorcery or anything like that. So they, up until now, have been pretty immune to it. They have certainly encountered demons. They don't really understand what they are. The Eldar are very, very aware of why playing with chaos is a bad idea. They accidentally made a chaos god, and the ones that survive are all being killed by it. So they are extremely hard to corrupt. The Necrons, of course, sold their souls to the Catan, who ate them, and their remaining sort of personality was transferred into robots. The Necrons, a bit like the Tau, when they were a biological species, they had very, very little warp presence. In fact, that's one of the main reasons they went to war with the old ones, is the old ones symbolized using the warp, and the Necrons were people who couldn't use the warp. Even more than that, when they then went through biotransference and got turned into robots, part of the deception is that the Catan got to eat their souls. So Necrons also have very little way of being affected by chaos. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen, just means it's a lot more rare. The Leagues of Votann are technically humans, but they're some of those Dark Age humans that were genetically engineered to be particularly good at going off into space, and therefore they're very warp resistant. Their psychic powers are very limited, very tightly controlled, and they're less likely to be tainted by chaos than normal humans. And then finally, the Tyranids are their own psychic thing that does their own psychic stuff, and again, a bit like the Orks, have their own way of interfering and stopping the warp getting in. So yeah, all the big factions that are Xenos in the galaxy seem to have their own way of dealing with chaos. In fact, maybe that's the reason they're the factions who have been around so long, because there were definitely other alien species that used to deal with chaos. We meet some of them during the Great Crusade, and they tend to be wiped out by humans or wipe themselves out. So aliens can be corrupted by chaos. By the point of 40k, all the ones that are still around seem to have some built-in way of stopping it, which leaves humanity as the massive liability in Warhammer, which is again very Warhammer. So there, a series of, as promised, much more difficult to answer questions full of grey areas and contradictions. If you'd like to see me answering some, let's say, a bit simpler questions, there's a whole other video of that on IGN. And of course, I have my own channel where I explain various things about the lore, the setting, and the game of Warhammer. You can find me on YouTube or Instagram or even Blue Sky as Arbitor Ian, and all the links are in the thing below. Thanks.